everyone. I'm so glad you could join us. It's going to be an exciting talk tonight with these two guys talking about a trip that, frankly, at my age, I would never take. But anyway, we're going to hear all about it. On behalf of the Great Chesapeake Bay Schooner Race and the American Schooner Association, I want to welcome you to our talk about John Smith's trip of 1608. And my name is Duncan Hood. I'll be your host tonight. And our two presenters, both very famous men in their own small worlds. We have John Mann. Hey, John. There you go. Chris Cerino. Yay, I'm glad you guys could join us. Awesome to see you, and thanks for bailing me out for this month. Kidding. We're going to take a little bit of a moment, and we're going to talk about the Sultana Foundation and what they do. Of course, we all know their flagship, Sultana, which, of course, participates in our October race each year down the Chesapeake Bay. I doubt if you made more than 12 miles this year because there was no wind whatsoever.
Yeah, none. Zip.
Hey, John, let's start with you. Let's tell me a little bit about who you are and what you're doing.
Great, thanks. My name is John Mann, and I manage the Lawrence Wetlands Preserve for Sultana, which is the newest component of our organization. We just cut the ribbon on our building less than a month ago, and so it's about 2 blocks from our headquarters in Chestertown is this really unique 8.5 acre piece of land on the outskirts of town, and it's mostly wetlands with a little bit of meadow and a little bit of forest, and we've done some reforestation there, and we use the property as a way to teach students to take a look at, hey, here's this little piece of land that's tucked in between a farm and a developed area, and let's look at what's happening to the water on its way to the river.
Now, John, if I remember, you guys have managed to work your programs into the curriculum of your county. Is that correct?
Yes, we work with every grade level, and sometimes we work with the grade levels multiple times throughout the year. We're kind of uniquely situated that our local public schools we're one of Maryland's smallest counties, so our local public schools are small enough that we can really work with all of the students throughout the year.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. Hey, Chris, tell me about you. Who the heck
are
you doing?
Yeah, so my name's Chris Cerino. I'm vice president of Sultana Education Foundation. I came on to the organization in 2000, just as Sultana was nearing completion of the construction phase of our business, and the boat was launched in 2001, and I was essentially hired to kind of start up the educational programs we do on the water.
Right.
And so the first year in 2001, I was actually on the boat as the education director, sort of implementing programs for schools and adult groups, getting the kinks out, getting the curriculum straight. And then it's been a pretty wild ride since then. You know, I'm in my 24th year now, and as John alluded to, we have a lot more going on than just Sultana. That's definitely still our flagship and the most visible thing that we do. We have a mobile fleet of canoes and kayaks. I'm sitting in a building right here in Chestertown, an 8,000 square foot education center where we do programming 12 months out of the year. We just opened the Lawrence Preserve, as John alluded to, that he manages, and I kind of oversee all of that and just kind of work with our senior staff members to make sure they have what they need and that everybody's schedule is full and that, you know, all the trains are running smoothly.
You guys have come a long way.
We have. We definitely.
Years ago, I was with National Maritime Heritage Foundation, and we were programming down there. And I remember being very impressed by your program.
Thank you.
Now, tonight, we're going to learn a little bit about John Smith's Voyage.
Yeah.
What are we going to look at? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is sort of one of the more interesting projects that Sultana Education Foundation has taken on in our history. So basically, the settlement of Jamestown was founded in 1607, and my colleague Drew McMullen and I were sitting around the office in like 2004, 2005, and Sultana was running on a nice full schedule, and we're like, what else could we do to like tell the Bay's story and reach more people? And it occurred to both of us that the 400th commemoration of Jamestown's founding was coming up in 3 short years, and I've always been a huge fan of John Smith's expeditions in the summer of 1608 and read his narratives and was really familiar with the story and just super fascinated by the descriptions of the pristine Chesapeake, you know, 400 odd years ago. And we were like, well, what about, has anybody ever built that little boat that he was traveling around? It probably was like a 25-foot boat. And as far as we knew, nobody had really made a replica of the little open boat or shallop that Smith used to take that voyage on. And we were like, hey, that's a manageable project. Like, we could raise that much money and build that boat here in Chestertown. We could probably do it in a few months, maybe take it around the bay and publicize, the project. And then wouldn't it be awesome if in 2007 we could work with Jamestown, launch the boat there, and then retrace Smith's voyages and bring the story to a general public audience? Yeah. And that's really what we're here to talk about tonight, is how that process went. John didn't mention that he was one of the modern crew members on the John Smith Shallop reenactment Voyage. So I
was going to say that.
When I'm showing you all photographs of this 2,000-mile voyage that John and his fellow colleagues undertook, look for his image, because he's in a lot of these pictures.
Absolutely awesome. Well, listen, everybody, I'm going to give you a couple ground rules before we get going. We are running a chat box and we're running a Q&A box right now. If you have any questions along the way, you can certainly type them in the Q&A, or if you'd like to chat with these two, either Chris or John, just type in the chat there. The way we're going to do is one of them is going to be talking and the other one will be watching these chat boxes. If you have any long, detailed questions you'd like to ask, of course, you can also wait till the end, but write them down so you don't forget them, especially at my age anyway. So having said that, let's get going, Chris. Hit your share screen and let's make this thing happen. Oh, the excitement, the excitement. There we go.
All right. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and narrate over a bunch of photographs that have almost no text on them. So, like, I will basically be the text. I hope you all like these images. I want to start kind of by giving the background story of who was Captain John Smith, what did he do in 1608 that was so interesting to us, and why did we think that was an important story to tell? I'll tell you a little bit about his historic voyages and the bay that he witnessed and recorded. And then we're going to morph from sort of the macro story to our micro reenactment voyage that John Mann was part of. And we have all kinds of images of that underway. Actually, that's a picture of it right there. That's our shallop, our reproduction of John Smith shallop sailing on the Rappahannock River, one of the most gorgeous rivers you could possibly explore on the modern bay. So we'll basically be doing like a historic part and then like a modern talk, and then we'll answer any questions anybody has. So let's get going. So
let's do this.
Who is this guy, Captain John Smith? Some of you may have heard that he interacted with Pocahontas. There was a really cheesy Disney movie called Pocahontas where there was a romantic interest there. That was all a myth, but he really is a fascinating individual. He was born to the equivalent of like a middle-class family in England to a yeoman farmer. He always wanted to improve his lot in life, which was really hard to do in Elizabethan England at the time in the early 17th century. So he ended up taking a real interest in the military, not unlike a lot of our youths today, and initially fought as a mercenary soldier in some wars in Europe, then really made a name for himself militarily anyway in Eastern Europe when he fought against the Turks and the Ottoman Empire. And during an impasse in a battle on the Turkish war front, one of the generals in the Ottoman Empire, to entertain the troops on both sides, said, hey, we'll send out our greatest warrior to fight your greatest warrior for the entertainment of the crowd. So they send out a soldier. The English sends out John Smith. John Smith goes in hand-to-hand combat with this Turkish soldier and lops off the guy's head.
Nice.
Well, that didn't sit well with that guy's buddy. So another Turkish soldier comes out to avenge his friend's death, and John Smith lops that guy's head off. And then a third guy comes out to fight John Smith, and he lops off a third guy's head. And if you ever see Captain John Smith's coat of arms that he earned from this heroic performance, it has 3 little Turks' heads on the bottom.
You are kidding me.
So this guy was tough as nails. He was tough as nails. His title of captain is a military rather than a nautical title. And he earned that title battling, the Turks, the Muslims over in Eastern Europe. He eventually got sold into slavery as a captive of war. He killed his slave master, stole his clothing and his horse, rode all across Eastern Europe, somehow manages to get back to England he hears of this fantastical voyage to the New World and decides he's going to enlist with this group of explorers to search it out. And so, sure enough, in the winter of 1606, this vessel, the Susan Constant, and two sister ships set out from England for the New World, and they end up sailing to the Chesapeake Bay. You can see from the Susan Constant's hull, she's not exactly slicing through the water. Ships of this era were kind of like giant bathtubs. They were really designed more for volume than for speed. And it really didn't matter so much because they were going around the North Atlantic Gyre or the Atlantic Gyre and just following trade winds. So you could basically, in a ship like this was a great vessel for getting out, into the Gulf, into that gyre and into the trade winds, setting your square sails and letting the wind just kind of push you from behind across the ocean. These vessels were awesome for that. The problem came when a boat like the Susan Constant tried to sail up the James River, as an example. If you've done any work in the Chesapeake, you know that the bay's rivers are windy. They have shoals. Back in these days, there would have been giant underwater oyster bars that were so massive they were nautical obstruction. So this was sort of the European solution to that problem when they were exploring faraway lands they were unfamiliar with. In the hold of their flagship, they would bring a smaller exploratory vessel that they often refer to as a shallop that they shipped in pieces, brought out of the hull when they made landfall. You can see they would anchor the ship like a mile or two offshore. They would slap these sort of work boats together and then use those boats to make the first landings. And then they would also send these little shallops up the rivers to map the depths in advance of the larger ships in the fleet and select sites for where they wanted to set up shop permanently. And so it's really from the decks of these little shallops that John Smith made the first thorough and systematic exploration of the Chesapeake that was ever recorded on paper. Now, the Indians had lived in the Chesapeake for at least 14,000 years before Smith and his men show up. But Smith is really the first one to write everything down, draw pictures, and he wrote extensively about the people that he saw, the ecosystem that he witnessed. It's pretty awesome stuff. If you haven't read his voyage narratives, you really should. All right, so here's the Chesapeake when Jamestown is established. I will say that there really was no map of the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay in the early 1600s was often shown as kind of like a large inlet off the coastline. Yeah. Europeans had popped in there, but mostly just down at the mouth of the bay to duck out of storms or maybe to reprovision. But at least in the written record, there had never been anybody that had sailed extensively to the fall lines or the head of navigation of each of the major rivers. And so there was really no comprehensive map of the estuary at all. So as a result, the folks at Jamestown, they really had no idea how far the main stem of the bay extended into the mainland. They really had no idea how many major rivers flowed into the Chesapeake itself. And these were all things that John Smith wanted to learn and that they really needed to learn if they wanted to ever expand beyond the banks of the James River. But it wasn't just for utilitarian reasons that in 1608 Smith sets out in this shallop to explore and map the bay. You need to recall that in the 15 and 1600s, Spain was actually making a huge fortune in Central and South America, and they had discovered gold. Well, hopefully, in terms of the English voyage, maybe gold was lining the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. That was one of the motivations that Smith recruited 14 men in 1608, boarded the shallop, and really made a thorough and systematic exploration. They were looking for riches. What he found instead was a Chesapeake teeming with life, both human and otherwise. So Smith, during his voyages from June 2nd, 1608 to September 7th of 1608, a little over like 3 months, he wrote extensively about the Native American cultures that he witnessed, what they were wearing, how they were hunting, what they were eating, when they were eating different foods, how their houses were set up, how their communities were designed, the role of men, the role of women, how their political entities function. If you want to learn about Native Americans in the Chesapeake region before first contact, you really should read some of John Smith's descriptions of Virginia, as he called it.
Yeah,
because they're absolutely fascinating.
Which tribes were there, Chris?
Yeah, so It depends. On the James River, right where the settlers set up shop was this confederacy of about 30 plus tribes that had been consolidated by a leader that the English referred to as Powhatan or Powhatan. And they were an Algonquin speaking language group that kind of dominated that part of what is today Virginia. As you came across the bay, one of the dominant tribes was the Nanacoke Indians, sort of on the middle eastern shore. Up on the Piscataway, you had the Piscataway Indians up the Potomac. You also had Piscataway Indians as well. Then when you got to the head of the bay, it was a whole different world of Iroquoian-speaking tribes like the Susquehannocks. Over here on the Sassafras, in our area, we had the Takwa tribe, which we believe was probably speaking a Lenape Indian dialect. On the Chester River, Smith unfortunately didn't come up this way, but at the mouth, he maps a tribe called Ozinis, which is probably near Rock Hall. So there were he mapped, and this is actually one of the amazing things about his map. He mapped over 230 different Indian towns, which is just a remarkable sort of primary record of who was living where.
There were a lot of people around here.
Yeah. Another thing that Smith described throughout his 3+ month voyage on the bay was the ecosystem that he witnessed. And some of his descriptions almost defy belief to the modern reader. So you see in the upper left there, like schools of herring and shad and menhaden that were so thick. There was one excerpt from Smith's journals when he's in the mouth of the Potomac that the fish were swimming so thick with their heads above the water that the men got out frying pans and were trying to catch fish over the gunnels of the shallop. There were a lot of animals that lived here that no longer live here, like red wolves, like passenger pigeons would have flown through here. Carolina parakeets would have come up in the fall to eat the mast coming off of the deciduous trees in the region. Giant sturgeon up to 12 feet long and 800 pounds, making spawning runs up to where these rivers get really narrow and skinny. So imagine being in like a part of the upper James where it's 25 feet wide and seeing a 12-foot long, 800-pound fish spawning right in front of you. It was unbelievable. So some of those descriptions are really, really pretty cool. And then when Smith is done with this voyage, as he's going up each river, he's taking notes, but he's also making sketches. You get the sense that he's looking at his compass. They're probably using a tool called the chip log to measure their distance. He's taking depth soundings, and he's making sketches of each individual river. And when he returns to England, he works with an engraver named William Hole, and in 1612, they published this map in Oxford, England, which is then widely reproduced. And this becomes the map of the bay for the next 75 years.
I was gonna say that's pretty good.
That's pretty remarkable. You got to remember the early 1600s was like this exploration boom where you have this massive influx, especially of Europeans, but of course later Africans and people from elsewhere that are coming to the region. And for 75 years, this is the map they probably had in their hands. That means when St. Mary's City was founded, they probably had this map in their hands. Smith later went up actually in the 17 period and made the first decent map of the New England coastline. This guy played a huge role in basically providing a blueprint for future, colonists from Europe and especially England to come set up shop in this area.
Wow.
So this voyage really is a neat story because Smith probably, if you live on a river that feeds the bay, Smith's shallop probably came right in front of your house 400 odd years ago. So it's a story that really connects all these rivers very nicely and tidily. But it also is really neat because he leaves us with this ecological benchmark of what the bay was capable of at sort of its most pristine ecological state. So it's kind of like, hey, that's what we should be shooting for. We'll never get back to that pristine, utopian ecosystem that he saw, but this is what the bay can do if given half the chance. So we thought it would be really neat if we recreated Smith's vessel, brought the vessel around and educated people about this voyage, and then launched the thing in 2007, hired 12 modern reenactors to basically follow in Smith's footsteps and bring this story to a greater public audience. So that's what these next two slides are.
It's a mighty bold thing.
It was a bold, we're pretty bold. We're kind of like the small nonprofit that could. That's kind of the way I look at it.
I think you're right. You bet.
So this whole initiative, we called it the Captain John Smith 400 Project. So the first thing we had to figure out was like, what did this boat look like? Like, what was the design? And how do you even go about figuring that out? Because there was no blueprint left by the Jamestown settlers themselves. So we looked at a lot of, paintings and images from England and the Thames River from this time period. One thing that really popped was on Smith's own map in the upper bay, right in front of a place called Howell Point near the mouth of the Sassafras. He shows this little vessel, which we think, it's his map, probably was a pretty good drawing of his shallop. It doesn't give you a ton of detail, but it does show you that it's a double-ended boat. It looks kind of like a Dutch shoe.
Sure does.
But it's a double-ended boat with sort of rounded ends. You can see one mast and a couple little shrouds, and then some sort of spar kind of diagonally across the top. So that was like, all right, that's a good starting point. We did a lot of research. Then we came across something really, really cool. In 1602, there was this guy named Bartholomew Gosnold who actually made one of the first English explorations of what we today call Cape Cod. And in his voyage narratives, he mentions that they anchor about 2 or 3 miles offshore, and that they brought out the one half of their shallop, and then they brought out the other part, and that the two pieces were then put next to each other on a beach and set together.
Wow. Like
So
full
he
boat.
mentions launching the one half of their shallop, rowing it to a beach, half of the boat, and then having the other half brought to shore later, whacking them together while the group was exploring on land. And by the time they got back that evening, the boat was ready to go. So it's like, all right, they've prefabricated this boat in such a way that it can be really quickly put back together. But also, if we're going to reuse Gosnold's narrative, and it's the closest thing we had to like, a verbatim description of how this worked, let's try to build it like that in 2 watertight halves so that each half could float just for long enough to get a small party ashore. And then how would they connect this thing? And it turns out that I can't remember the name of this museum. It was a whaling museum up in New England that had also thought about building Gosnold's shallop and had a blueprint of how that might work. And so we kind of took their plans and modified it. Here we've hired a local artist named Mark Castelli, one of the best Chesapeake Bay artists that there is.
Yeah.
And he showed a rendition of how this might have worked. So you can see there's 2 halves of the boat, and there's a bulkhead on what would basically be the stern of each half, just tall enough to keep the water out as you rode to shore. You can also see there's a piece of the keel that drops out. There's pieces along the gunnels that pop out. And then so there'd be these braces where the boat came together. So you could whack the bulkheads together amidships, and then you could whack the keel over that seam on the bottom, and then do the same thing over the gunnels on top. And that's how we think they might have done this. And I'm sure there are multiple ways these boats could have been prepackaged, but this was explicitly described by Gosnold in 1602. The reason we thought he was such an important figure is because he was one of the 3 captains on the Jamestown voyage in 1607. So only 5 years later, this same guy that described the 2-piece shallop is now part of the Jamestown voyage. So why not bring the same style shallop that had worked so well for him in Cape Cod? So here's another rendering of the boat put together. If you look really, really carefully amidships and on the keel, you can see that little seam where the 2 halves come together.
Right.
And then here's a real life image of us recreating this at the Sultana shipyard. This is where Sultana was constructed, which is really neat, kind of bring the shipyard back to life. This is about 1 block up the road from where I'm sitting right now.
Nice.
We tried really hard to stick to traditional 17th century tools and methodologies. We learned really, really quickly that electricity is really, really nice to have, especially when you're sawing big old planks and dealing with woodworking. We put on a nice show for the public, but when it was really time to cut the big timbers and whatnot, your secret's safe with me, but like we did use some power tools. But that was one of the neat things, is that we would at least show people the techniques and the tools they might have used back in the day. And you can see here, we're almost done with our construction, and you can see those bulkheads in the middle, which led to probably one of the most bizarre boat launches in the history of boat launches. because here you see us. I don't know if any listeners out there are familiar with Sultana's downrigging weekend, but we have this big festival at the end of our sailing season in like late October, early November. We invite all the tall ships in the really in the mid-Atlantic, especially in the Chesapeake and Delaware bays, to come join us. I know Pride of Baltimore has been there many times, Lady Maryland, a lot of the classic boats you see in the schooner race. So we decided to launch the shallop on downrigging weekend, which meant there was going to be a big crowd there. But if you look carefully at that picture, we didn't launch the whole boat. The boat was on an inclined plane. The whole boat was held together by one big dowel rod in the middle. And the governor of Maryland at the time was this guy named Robert Ehrlich. And we invited him to come, saw that dowel rod in half, which would then set, this half of the boat into the water. None of us had ever done any of this before. We had no idea how a half shallop was going to float and handle in the water. But if you had been at this launch and you didn't know what we were trying to do, people were like, why are they sawing this perfectly cool boat in half? What the hell are they doing? It was all intentional. It was designed to educate people about this sort of interesting technique that we had learned that they use. So one of my favorite images is this one, where here's half of the boat with 3 people in it rowing around the harbor of Chestertown. And that's when we were like, okay, this definitely is one of the ways they could have done this. And that was really neat because it worked. And if that thing had sunk, I don't know what we would have done. It would have been a lot of scrambling, but it worked. And it was a really educational moment, I think, for all of us. It was really cool.
Must have been really heavy.
It was heavy, definitely. And we'll get to that a little bit later when John starts talking about moving this thing around the bay. So that was 2005. In 2006, we still had a year before, the Jamestown commemorative, ceremony and celebrations down there. So we did this museum tour and brought the shallop to some of the more iconic locations all around the Chesapeake Bay. This is one of the more comical mishaps that we had. We brought this is the National Geographic headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Oh my
So
goodness.
imagine, first of all, driving a 17th century shallop around on a trailer in downtown Washington, D.C. just to get to this place. Then imagine trying to get this boat into a foyer of a building. And we managed to get all that done. And we put the boat, the way we displayed the boat is we put the 2 halves really close to each other, but left about a foot wide gap. So people could see that it was actually 2 half shallops. And then we would put the rigging up separately. The problem we had with this situation is we set this up and the crew had put a bunch of linseed oil on the boat the day before because we knew it was going to be out of the water for a really long time. Well, that was fine when the boat was outside, but you get a fresh load of linseed oil on a wooden boat in the foyer of a modern building like this with AC vents. Within seconds, everybody's office in this entire complex smelled like they had their nose over a can, of linseed oil. And the phone was ringing off the hook. And before we even got back to Chestertown, they were like, look, y'all, I know this was a lot of work, but you got to get this thing out of here because our staff can't work in their offices. So the next morning we had to motor back here and there was a place in the front sort of plaza where we were able to display it. It was still pretty cool. It was really cool right there. But anyway, we took this around to places like the Maryland Science Center, the State House in Annapolis. There's a science center down in Richmond, Virginia, where we took the vessel. That went really, really well. And it was a way to kind of let people know also that in 2007, we were going to be using this same boat on a voyage to reenact the story that was on all the interpretive panels that were accompanying the shallop as it went to all these museums. And the last exhibit space that we put the boat was at this place called Nauticus down in Norfolk, Virginia, a wonderful facility. And they were really kind to us. And this is the day that we first launched the boat. Now, if you're not familiar with wooden boats, the longer a wooden boat is out of the water, it's not necessarily a good thing because wooden boats shrink. So if you've had a boat like this that's been out of the water, in our case for over a year, they're going to launch it and there's going to be these big gaps in the planking. And what traditional shipbuilders would have done is put this stuff called caulking in the seams to sort of temporarily keep the boat relatively buoyant until the wood had time to swell up. We'll get to that a little bit later, but this is the boat about to hit the water as a fully, attached one vessel operation in its history. Yeah. And then this was the route that we chose to to reenact Smith's voyages. And what Smith actually did is he went out from June 2nd to late July and did like a 6-week voyage where they came back to Jamestown, reprovisioned for a couple of days, recruited a couple new crew members, and then went back out and then went to the head of the bay and hit every river they'd missed. We decided not to do that. We're like, look, we're already asking these reenactors to live on a boat with no AC, with no toilet. It's 25 feet long and 6 feet wide. Like, that's hard enough. Let's combine Smith's 2 voyage journeys into one. We'll still cover the same water, but we'll eliminate sort of repeating ourselves, especially when there's no events planned. And one of the neat things is along this voyage route, we worked with over 30 different waterfront communities to set up events. So there were 30 waterfront festivals based around the shallop arriving, our crew being there in 17th century garb. We had a mobile tent we would bring with a display to tell all about Smith's voyages, the bay in the 17th century, and the Native American tribes. And that was all really very exciting. But we honestly had no idea if we were going to be able to actually do any of this, because nobody had ever been in a traditional shallop. I mean, who had? I don't know anybody that has. So we're like, all right, what was actually in some ways more difficult about the reenactment than Smith's voyage is that he didn't have to be anywhere, right? So if he got a nice southerly wind and they wanted to head to the northern bay, they could just throw up their sails and go as long as that wind propelled them so they didn't have to row. We couldn't do that. We were like, we have to be, in Vienna, Maryland on the Nanticoke in 3 days. And if the wind's in our face, we still have to be there because they have this whole town coming to see this. And they've been promoting it. So there was a lot of pressure, and we had no idea if the crew was going to be able to pull it off. So that was a nerve-wracking time. The captain of the shallop was this guy named Ian Bystrom. He had been previously the mate and second captain on the schooner Sultana. So we knew Ian very well. We knew he had the kind of temperament, very calm, mild-mannered, good with people that we needed. So he was our first hire, and he went about hiring the rest of the crew, which included John Mann. And we're about to turn the mic over here to John Mann, because very soon, in like March of 2007, and again, Jamestown was kind of started in like late April, early May of 1607. We took the boat down to First Landing State Park and started some sea trials, which was very interesting. But before we did the sea trials, we launched the boat. As I said, we put it in the water, and this is the shallop crew's first day on the job. You've taken this job. You're like, this is going to be so romantic and exciting. I'm going to go 2,000 miles in this cool reproduction vessel, and you show up to work on the first day, and that's what you see. And that's where I'm going to turn it over to John. And he's like one of those guys in that picture. I think he's the last guy with his hands in his pocket, wondering what the hell he just got himself into. So this was a pretty modest beginning to what became a pretty intense voyage. So why don't you take it a little bit from here, John?
All right. Hey, John, before you start, let me take a moment to tell everybody, again, we have a chat box running and we have Q&A. So if you'd like to ask any questions as we go, type them in and one of these two guys will respond to you. Thanks for joining us. Let's keep going.
Okay, great. So like Chris mentioned, the boat had been out of the water for a long time. So when it was launched at Nauticus, they intentionally submerged the boat, right? Get as much of that wood underwater and let the swelling process begin to make it watertight. I did not come from a sailing background. Some of these people had sailed on other ships. We kind of came from a variety of backgrounds, but I'd say maybe 25% of us didn't really know our way around the sailboat, and I was one of those people. So I was probably the most shocked to show up and find the boat in this state. And our first order of business was to get the water out of the boat. So I think Chris has another picture here where you see us using bilge pumps and buckets and whatever we could find to try to get the boat floating again.
How long was
there we go.
At that point?
It was pretty chilly. Yeah. You can see the captain is the one up on the docks just giving us our marching orders, but we were young and didn't know any better, so we were excited to get in there and start the adventure. So we had to bail her out, and then like Chris mentioned, we no, there wasn't someone we could go to talk to for advice on how to sail the boat, and the itinerary had already been laid out, and the plans were in place where if the boat wasn't making enough progress, there was a tow vessel that could come and tow us. So we couldn't miss any of the events, basically. We'd made all these plans with these towns.
Yeah.
But as a crew, our sense of pride and we wanted to make sure that we moved the boat where it needed to move. We didn't want to have to be towed. So I can remember those early, what we're calling the sea trials, when we were learning to sail and learning to row. Captain Ian constantly looking at our speed and keeping track of our speed and doing these calculations and knowing we have to be able to maintain this rate to be able to make what we said we were going to do. We had 2 women on board who were collegiate rowers, crew athletes. So I guess that's the closest approximation we could find to these big, heavy oars. We're nowhere near as graceful as a crew boat, but they helped us with some of the terminology and just how to communicate and work as a unit. We had 12 people on board, and we would row with as many as 8 oars. And so the way we kind of made that work was there were 3 groups of 4. And so if you were going on an hour shift, you might spend 40 minutes of that rowing and 20 minutes of that not rowing. So if there was any kind of wind, even if you were sailing slower than you could row, the benefit of not having to put out your own energy made sense to take advantage of any of that, as much of that wind as we could.
Boy, you know.
We also learned early on, I think maybe from putting this picture on the internet, I'm not sure, someone told us that we had our sail on upside down. So we kind of were embarrassed and made adjustments and fixed that.
Nice.
I wouldn't know.
What this picture doesn't show, but John alluded to, was me and Drew back here in Chestertown constantly calling these guys like, what was your top speed in this much wind? Like, and when they told us they were, I think on this day, you could see it's a pretty nice breezy day. They were making like 5 knots. We were like celebrating, jumping all over the office because we really had no idea. And when they were rowing, I think their top speed was maybe 2 plus. But then if you combine that with a nice current that's following you, you might be able to get that up to 3, maybe 3.5. And, over time that all adds up.
And you guys, you got sideboards up there too, right?
I was going to say those red coats. That's great, Chris, because that's our foul weather gear. And it was, springtime in Hampton Roads. And so I remember it was cold and rainy, and you're close to the water in that boat. It's basically an oversized canoe. And so, yeah, there we are sailing. And then compare this. This looks like this is on the Rappahannock. So that was probably towards the tail end of our journey. And everybody looks tanned and kind of relaxed. I see people reading books while we're sailing. Well, that was a much better day. And one of the things we also learned was we didn't really know what to expect. I hadn't done a lot of cruising around the Chesapeake prior to this. I grew up in Baltimore. I knew the parts of the bay that you kind of saw from the major bridges and roadways or some of the major vacation spots, but this took us into almost every little corner of the bay. And we quickly came to realize that there are large stretches where you're kind of surrounded by what we call these John Smith views. You'd get up onto the Nanticoke or the Rappahannock and you couldn't see signs of human habitation, and you could kind of imagine, I guess the trees would have been bigger for him, but that there are spaces where you could see, okay, this is probably what he was looking at.
Man.
This is a day where just you can see in the water there, it's dead calm, no wind, hot, and we were rowing.
Oh, golly.
Speaking of rowing.
Oh, look
at
that.
That's me getting all patriotic for the 4th of July. And I guess you got to make it fun so you don't think too much about the hard work of it. You had to be in unison with those oars too, because if you were a little too slow or a little too fast, you can see how close my back is to the oar behind me. You would feel that pretty quickly if you were out of unison.
Man.
And then this picture, I was not excited to be on this boat when I first heard of it, because I had a fear that we were going to try to do a 100% as accurate as we could historical, dress the part, live the part. Once I learned that wasn't the case, I was more interested.
Mm.
But then once you're out there, you start to say, well, what would it be like if we tried to dress the part and live the part? So a few of us, the guys in this picture here, the guy in the foreground is Donkey. That's me in the middle. And then that's Austin behind me. We decided that we were going to have what we called our 1608 week, where we wore our funnies, our period correct costumes, and we only ate cold oatmeal. And basically, it wasn't hard enough. We decided we were going to make ourselves suffer more. We're not wearing hats and sunglasses.
Wow.
I don't know that we learned anything too deeply out of that, other than we were glad that it was a choice that we could revert back to the more modern style.
Be glad when
And
that
you can
was
see,
covered.
yeah, and you can see.
Oh God.
Oh yeah.
This looks fun, doesn't it?
Oh man, I can hardly wait.
So I think what this is I mentioned we'd work kind of in shifts, and you would work so hard to build up the momentum on the boat that when it came time to make a change, you didn't want to lose all that speed. So we'd usually do like 1 or 2 hard minutes and just really build up as much speed as we could, kind of a sprint, and then quickly change your seats and continue the rowing so that the boat didn't lose too much of that momentum.
Oh man. Oh God.
Yeah, and I think I started out trying to wear rowing gloves, and they made fun of me so much that I just did what everyone else did, and you went bare hands, and the blisters were a badge of honor. We joked that we grew our gloves.
That's what friends are for.
That's right. And so this is a picture I kind of remember this day where we just weren't making that turn. The wind was coming right at us, and the tide. It was also probably an outgoing tide, and whatever we tried to do, we weren't making any headway. So we dropped anchor, and we were just waiting. And I remember asking Ian, I was like, "Hey, it's pretty shallow here. Can we just throw a line in the water and just let's walk the boat around. Once we get around this turn, then the wind's in a more favorable direction and we can continue sailing." And he thought about it. We talked about it. We were like, "Do we think this is cheating?" And we were like, "No, like we're moving the boat. It's under our power. We're not tying up and having someone tow us."
Yeah.
So we agreed that we were okay with this compromise, and we thought probably Smith and his men would have approved of that decision.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that we really learned kind of as an organization from a historical slant is how exhilarating it must have been for these folks when they got a breeze heading in the right direction for an extended period of time. Like you kind of take that for granted today because when that doesn't happen now, you just crank up your John Deere and go.
Yeah.
If you didn't have that wind, you were rowing or sitting at anchor doing nothing. And so when you got one of these breezes that was favorable to you, you would milk it. You would go through the night. You would wake up at weird hours of the morning to take advantage of tides and winds. And you got super, super in tune to weather, tides, and those variables that today we don't really need to be as in tune to because we have electronics and engines and whatnot to compensate. The other thing we learned is that Smith absolutely could have pulled this off and did pull this off based on his map. And that was something a lot of people were like, I don't think he actually did all that. And I was like, well, how do you think he made this map? And they were like, well, we'll see what happens when you all go out there. Well, we did. We were able to make all these events. We had to do some crazy stuff, like get up at 2 a.m. to catch an oncoming tide or whatnot. But it was definitely possible. But your whole mode of like time and everything has to be completely put to the side. And you have to get into that 17th century mentality pretty quickly to make it work. And speaking of that.
Yeah, so we had to teach a story that some of us were more familiar with than others. Some of us didn't know too much about. So, Sultana is primarily an education organization. If we were going to be out there representing Sultana, they wanted to make sure we were giving accurate information. So not only did we learn, how to physically move the boat, but we had to be schooled up so that we could know what we were talking about. So Sultana brought in a number of experts in their fields because we were teaching the ecology and the history of the period. So this is a picture from our old headquarters in Chestertown that Chris and I remember fondly. Chris is talking to you from our new headquarters, which it's night and day the difference in. But it looks like this is probably a crash course in Chesapeake Bay Ecology 101.
Yep. That's a guy named John Page Williams. He's written a ton of books. He's worked for the Bay Foundation for a million years. Super knowledgeable guy and a great storyteller. And we had a lot of those. This is a guy named Kent Mountford. He was part of a research team with a woman named Helen Roundtree and a guy named Wayne Clark. And they wrote basically a play-by-play narrative of where they thought Smith's voyage was on every single day of this trip. And he knew all kinds of stuff. Just a really fascinating guy. You remember this guy, John?
Yeah, that's what's Ed
Hale.
Yep.
So
yeah,
he has this traditional wooden workboat. He lives on the Rappahannock. He was a smith. I mean, there were some people that we met that were so into the John Smith story. It was wild. And he'd written this. He basically took every firsthand account from Jamestown and put it into one volume and called it the Jamestown Narratives. And it's an invaluable resource if you want to read up on Jamestown from like a first person perspective. But he really loved working with us, and he was a fascinating guy in his own right. And now let's get to the nitty gritty, John, of living on this little rowboat with a bunch of strangers.
Right. So, like I said, I was not interested in we're going to do it just like he did it, except for that 1 week. But Sultana, we quickly decided, no, this is going to be a modern voyage. So, some obvious differences. We had women in our crew, right? And they were as tough, if not tougher, than the men in the group. And we bought our provisions and used modern cooking, and you probably saw plastic tubs shoved under the benches and things like that. And the way we kind of made things work is each week, 2 people on the crew were the people in charge of meals for that week. They would do the shopping, they would do the cooking, and the boat, while this is where we're going to be on these dates, they were usually around weekends for the festivals. The day-to-day, where are we going to end up on this particular Monday, that was unknown. And a lot of that really depended on what were the conditions that day, right? Did we do big miles? Did we have to drop anchor and wait for things? So there were people who had reached out to us that said, hey, I've got a dock, I've got property if you want. But for the most part, when it got to be where we'd done what we were going to do for that day, we would look for a dock that had room for us to tie up, someone's private dock. We'd send a few people up to their house to knock on their door and tell them who we were. And hopefully they were accommodating. And that was really one of the best aspects of this trip is for the entire, 121 days, Chris, no one ever turned us away. Awesome. People were like, people are like, yeah, you can stay here. Yes, you can put up your tents in my yard. Some people even went a step further and said, come sleep in my house, or we've got a guest cabin, come stay there, So I kind of equate it to if you live on the water and you have a dock big enough to accept our boat, you're probably somewhat into this kind of thing or find this somewhat interesting. So the people were really excited, and that's what we would do. We would move the boat as far as we could. We'd come to shore and we'd start, we'd make camp for the night.
Yeah, a couple of things that really helped us here is as the voyage went on, we started generating more and more publicity. And so people that were on these rivers knew we were coming. And some of the, the people with the nicest waterfront setups were really excited because they heard we were on our way and they wanted us to stay there. That was really cool. And I remember kind of feeling sorry for the crew one day and going to visit them at a nearby campsite in Rock Hall and turning the corner and I see a volleyball going up and then I see everyone drinking beer and I'm like, why am I feeling sorry for these guys? They're having the time of their life and people are hooking them up. So that was really neat. And in a way, it was reminiscent of what happened to Smith. Not every time, but a lot. Like sometimes they'd get shot at and have to sleep in the middle of the river. But a lot of times they'd be welcomed with open arms for their trade goods because they had intentionally brought things like glass beads and looking glasses. And then they would trade for venison or corn. And That's the only way they were able to do that voyage. If the Indians hadn't helped them out, they were just going to be able to be out there for 3 or 4 days and would have had to come back and reprovision.
Yeah.
So in some ways, obviously there were a lot of differences, but in some ways it was kind of like life imitating history, which is really fascinating.
That's a great story.
And meals were simple. So my experience with this, I'd done some long distance travel. I'd hiked the Appalachian Trail, so I kind of knew like, all right, what kind of food is going to keep and is going to help restore your calories that you're burning. So there's a lot of one pot meals, lots of carb loading, and because we also didn't have a lot of space for extra dishes, right? So it was like, what can we throw into that big giant stock pot? And then everybody's going to scoop into their bowls, and it's going to be filling enough that we're going to have enough energy to go the next day. So yeah, this might be tuna pasta or rice and whatever, rice and chicken. And then we also had to work with, different people's dietary preferences and food allergies.
What's up with that hat?
It's a great hat.
Pretty cool hat, right? Yeah. Hey, out there, it's all about function over fashion, Chris.
You bet.
All right. Oh, the inevitable question.
Yeah. Children are never shy about asking this. Sometimes adults are too polite to ask, but you're on this tiny little boat with all these people. Where do you go to the bathroom? So this is one of our educational stops here at First Landing State Park. We actually spent the first 3 or 4 weeks before we left Jamestown living in one of their facilities, and that was when we were getting schooled up. So we got to work with some of their local school groups, and Liz is showing them our luggable loo. It's nothing too fancy. It's a 5-gallon bucket with a lid and same sort of chemical treatment you would put in any sort of toilet there that's not connected to plumbing. So that's the short answer. The long answer is, you would, like a lot of sailors probably know, is you try not to use your head as much as you can, right? You do as much of that on land before you leave the docks because it just makes life easier. Sometimes emergencies would come up. We got close enough with each other that it was no big deal for someone to go to the bow. We'd put up a little privacy screen that we affectionately called the shitsel, and you would do your business. And then when we got to town, to land, we would take care of cleaning it out.
All right.
Very nice.
Yeah. So this was a big sort of push for the whole reason we did this voyage, is to basically get this story out there and help people understand that the bay hasn't always looked like it does today, that it used to look a lot different. And then, we've impacted it in tremendous ways, culturally, economically, ecologically. And so our exhibit kind of told the story of the 17th century bay. And so by comparing and contrasting, it's very evident to people that, we've got work to do if we want to get the bay up to what it, had been. So this was a traveling tent that we had a staff member whose whole job was to put this tent up, put the exhibit up, break it down, and drive to the next stop.
Whoa.
That ended up being kind of a hard job because this tent was not small for what we were doing.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure John can talk about like what it was like to be in these totally isolated stretches of rivers where you don't even see a house for several hours. And then the next day you're talking to hundreds of people that are just peppering you with questions about, everything that's in the tent and what the voyage was like. So why don't you tell us about that, John?
Yeah. And tent makes it sound simple, but it was like a mini carnival coming to town, and you can see kind of the graphics behind us. A lot of the artwork was by Mark Castelli. So it was a beautiful thing. And technology, there was a computer in there where you could see where we'd been, and a TV playing a video of it. This map showed all our stops. But yeah, the moving the boat during the week felt like you were getting paid to have an adventure. Interacting with the public, that's where it was the job, because you might have been answering the same 10 questions 100 times in a row for 2 hours.
Yeah.
But that was important because that was the whole reason we were out there. That's why we were getting paid to have this adventure, was to bring this story to people all around the bay. So yes, someone asked, they wanted to know about like the day-to-day life. Here's some great candid looks at it. We had these little REI tents. It was 2 people to a tent. We got really good at setting them up. It became a competition who could set up and break down their tent the fastest. And
Ooh,
like Chris
that looked
said,
pretty.
yeah, there were some really nice spots. I mean, as you know, there's really nice waterfront around the bay, and we weren't dummies. You know, if we saw a nice property, we'd probably pull up there and ask them if we could camp on their really nice property. Saw, you know, countless sunsets and sunrises. This is Speed putting down the tent. That's me holding the tent up and shaking all the debris out of it. That's my tent mate, Andy. Uh, catch a nap when you can, right? Take any break you can. So Donkey's a shorter guy than I am. He could curl up right here in the bow. Looks like he's using our sail as a pillow. But like Chris mentioned, sometimes at the spur of the moment, conditions would be ripe for sailing at 2 a.m, and Ian would be like, "We got to go," and we would, you know, within 30 minutes be in the boat sailing. So yeah, sometimes you were working during the night and sleeping during the day.
Yeah, and you could see how uncomfortable that looks. And one of the things that was really remarkable about Smith's expedition is when they would come up a river system, they had no idea who was even there, let alone what kind of reception they were going to get. So if they hadn't met a tribe yet, they would anchor the shallop in the middle of wherever they were and sleep on the boat. So imagine 15 grown men on a 25-foot, 6-foot wide boat with all of their gear and armaments and clothing and extra sails. And like, how did they do that? These were some tough people. And again, it really made you appreciate the physical nature of what life was like in those times, and just the things that they dealt with and tolerated that we just wouldn't even go there in the modern era.
No sleep number beds.
Yeah, one of the things that was kind of neat is the Voyage did go in like a multi-state cycle. So we were in Virginia, then we went up to Maryland. We actually went into Delaware when we went way up the Nanticoke. So we commemorated that on the shallop, the two boards in the middle, kind of split between Maryland and Virginia. And then this was a really neat part of the story, and probably one of the most impactful for us as participants was there's a lot of Native Americans that are still around here that trace their lineage back to this time period. So this is members of the Rappahannock Indian tribe, a state-recognized tribe in Virginia that met us at the town of Tappahannock, right down the river from their sort of traditional homelands. They were doing traditional dances for us, but I think this, for many of us, was a really fascinating part of the voyage. We got to work with a lot of these different groups. This is a guy named Chief T. Norwood, who at the time was the chief of the Nanticoke Indians of Delaware. This is a group from the Patawomic tribe in Virginia along the Potomac River. This is a woman from, I want to say, the Accomack tribe. It might be the Accahannock down near Crisfield. John, tell them about this interesting event. This is at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum on the Patuxent River.
Yeah, throughout the voyage, we were all pretty sensitive to the fact that we wanted to make sure in our language we said we were commemorating Smith's voyage rather than celebrating Smith's voyage, because you can imagine if your ancestors were those Native Americans, that Smith coming to the Chesapeake Bay and all the English that were going to follow him, that's not something that they would celebrate. So we, like Chris said, we had a lot of really positive interactions with local tribes at places we went, but this one was kind of a tense feeling for me anyway, probably because in this one, we were all dressed up in period clothing. So it kind of felt the most like a reenactment. We sailed up to shore, and these men met us on the shoreline, and they were shouting at us in a language we didn't understand. And then they motioned that they wanted Ian, our captain there, to come with them into one of the wigwams. And so we're all kind of, it's almost like dead silence. We're all walking together, almost like a standoff type moment. And they go into the wigwam, and they're probably in there for like 5 minutes, and the rest of us are kind of standing around looking at each other. Is this going to be okay? What's going on? Right. And then Ian came out, and he kind of came over to us, and we're like, Ian, what happened in there? What'd they say to you? He's like, well, we went in there and they said, all right, how long do we have to stay in here? We just totally misread it. They were all totally relaxed and telling jokes inside the wigwam.
Great story.
Yeah, good times. Yeah, and then some people went all out to greet
Yeah.
us. So this was up near Fredericksburg, where these gentlemen, I believe they had Native American ancestry as well, and they had created this really cool dugout canoe that was functional, which I don't think any one of us had seen before, which was really, really cool.
Mm.
And they were zipping around. I remember that really impressed us, the speed at which they moved around the water, because that was one of the things with the shallop. It wasn't very fast, right? And Chris has mentioned a few times that Smith was relying on peaceful exchanges, right? Their survival depended on being able to trade with the Native Americans along the way, and also getting information from them. And so this was kind of a famous story from Smith's voyage. Phones Cliff on the Rappahannock, and you can see this is one of those what we would call a John Smith view, where the trees might have been a little taller, but this is kind of what he was seeing. And Smith had an encounter where they are sailing, and a whole fleet of dugout canoes emerge from the tree line and start heading towards them. And so Smith and his men, they angle their the shallop away from those canoes, which is leading them towards Phones Cliffs, these tall sandy cliffs there. And it was a very calculated ambush, because as they got close to the cliffs, there were archers waiting at the top of those cliffs who just started unleashing arrows down at the boat. And the men had to kind of duck down below the side boards, and there's these boards on the side of the boat called the lee boards, which are kind of like our version of a skeg, and they were lifting those up and using them basically as shields.
Wow.
Yeah, really cool stuff. And what's really neat about something like this is that you can imagine that happening, because it probably looks pretty damn similar to what Smith saw, other than the fact that these aren't old growth forests, and that's what he would have seen. But so these were, I think, something that really struck our crew and our staff as we traveled around these rivers was like just how much of this type of country is really still out there. Here we are in the mid-Atlantic in one of the most heavily populated bands of, concentrated development in the whole country. And yet right here on this estuary, we have all these creeks and rivers that are really lightly developed for pretty long stretches until you get to the towns and cities. So this is just one example. Accahannock Creek down in the lower Delmarva, the Nanticoke John's alluded to, is just almost entirely marsh, soft marsh edge shoreline that's really kind of undevelopable, but it creates this gorgeous, landscape where you just don't see any houses for miles at a time.
It's remarkable.
Really, really neat. Yeah, this was probably one of the cooler things for the organization. There was a big festival in DC in June that Sultana went to, and it just happened to be coinciding with when the shallop was trying to make its way up to DC for the same event. And we crossed paths, albeit briefly. And this is kind of the last set of our pictures. I said earlier, we had like 30 community events, 30 festivals. Imagine a small nonprofit coordinating 30 waterfront festivals at 30 different towns around the entire bay in one summer. It was a lot of work, but some of these little towns, man, they really turned out. Like, so this is First Landing State Park, but what we found is actually the smaller the town, the bigger the deal we were when we showed up. So places like Vienna on the Nanticoke, or Havre de Grace and Perryville, at the base of the Susquehanna, they would go all out. And then we show up into Baltimore and we were this tiny little boat getting dwarfed by the Constellation. So that was interesting. Tell us about some of these, what's going on here, John?
Yeah, Governor O'Malley came on board with us. We had a few politicians come on board throughout, but I think Governor O'Malley was the most excited to, show off his guns, wear his sleeveless Under Armour. He was singing Irish sea shanties as we rode into Annapolis Harbor. So that was really cool.
Yeah, we also were able to procure a letter from both Governor O'Malley and I want to say Governor Tim Kaine at the time, but we had letters from the governors of Maryland and Virginia. So when John and Ian would go up and randomly ask a property owner if we could stay there, we had sort of some pretty significant documentation to try to nudge them in the right direction.
You got some cred.
Yeah, here's Port Deposit. As I said, they went berserk over this. They loved it there, and they really made a big to-do out of it.
Yeah, that was really cool because Port Deposit and Perryville are just separated by a few miles, and this flotilla of kayaks escorted us between the two towns.
Oh, super fun.
All right, bring us home, John.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me personally, and I think a lot of people on the boat, it if you didn't pay attention, you just kind of when the Chesapeake Bay news breaks through to the mainstream, a lot of it is negativity, right? It's pollution, it's dead zones, it's runoff. So I think a lot of us came in thinking, all right, we're going to reenact Smith's Voyage, but we're kind of doing it in a dead estuary. And as I hope I've conveyed tonight, that we found the exact opposite to be true. We were blown away by how many beautiful natural places there are still around in the bay. And that picture with dolphins coming alongside. Yeah, we're sailing in the golden hour here. That's there you go. Austin's got that 1,000-yard stare. Sometimes we were loud and silly. Sometimes it was quiet and reflective. And then coming into Jamestown, it was kind of funny because when we left Jamestown, it was a big celebration. But with the unpredictability of the boat, we kind of came in when only random people who happened to be there were there at the exact moment we made our landing back on the shores.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, I think I have one more image here. Let me see if I'm having trouble. There we go.
There
So
you
one of
go.
the reasons we did this, in addition to just being a great educational story to tell, is we're actually working with a lot of groups to push some legislation through Congress that ultimately was successful and became the Captain John Smith National Historic Trail, the first all-water National Historic Trail in the country. The idea behind this was that this was going to help potentially preserve some of these Smith views with conservation easements and whatnot, but also just try to improve public access to the bay and sort of tell the whole story of the Chesapeake, not just, Europeans forward, but indigenous cultures, what the ecosystem was like. And so that's what we did. This picture sort of represents like the future. This was a young lady in Tappahannock, Virginia, where we had a really awesome event, just kind of gazing out of the shallop. And I thought it was kind of symbolic of like, these kids, that's the future of our estuary. So if we're not getting them fired up about these stories and letting them know what the bay once was and like, hey, maybe we can work together to get some of that back. If we're not doing that, it's on us, because this is the future. This little girl and all of her colleagues in elementary school at the time. And that's really kind of what our whole organization is about. We feel like we're out there turning that light switch on in people's heads that, hey, the Chesapeake is a really cool place with a lot of cool stories. And hey, Sultana treated me to a really good time, and now I want to learn more, and now I care about this place. And that's the first step in being a future steward of the estuary. So that's kind of the story of the Captain John Smith 400 project. I'd be happy to take any questions. I've been doing my best to keep up with the chat, but it's been kind of hard to advance the slides and do that.
You don't have
Chris, I might briefly mention where that boat is, that vessel in that picture. So
yeah, that's a good question. That's a good one.
So, Sultana, originally we planned to continue using that boat. It wasn't completely decided on in what capacity, how would we use it. One idea that was thrown out there was maybe doing trips for high schoolers. Outward Bound, I think, does something similar in the New England area. And so, but really, in our exit interview as crew, Chris and Drew McMullen, our president, were kind of like, what was this like? How could we continue to use this boat? And I think we really impressed upon them just how physically hard it was to move that boat, and just how dubious we were that groups of teenagers could do it and enjoy it. And if you just happen to get a few people who maybe were signed up and didn't really want to be there, it really took all of us working together. And impressively, we didn't really have any big blowups or arguments with each other. So you needed the right group of people to make the boat work. So long and short, we didn't really end up running programs with it. It stayed in Chestertown as an educational exhibit. And then we realized it would be better served and could probably reach more people with the Maritime Museum in St. Michael's. So we gave it to them. I think they tried doing some stuff on the water with it for a little bit, and then kind of realized a lot of the lessons we had learned. So now it's a dry exhibit at the Maritime Museum. It's out of the water. it couldn't go back in the water because you can probably see daylight in between the boards. But if you're in St. Michael's and you haven't seen it, check it out, because that's the boat we've been telling the story about tonight.
Yeah, I was there just last week, and yes, you can see daylight through the boards.
That's better than being sunken and having a family of ducks kind of nesting in it.
I think that's true. Gentlemen, a very, very impressive presentation. Obviously, you've done this before. I am most impressed. I think I'm most impressed by the quality of your pictures.
Thanks. Yeah.
Did you have a chase boat come alongside from time to time?
Yeah. So, some of these were taken by the shallop crew themselves.
Yeah.
A lot of times somebody like me would come out with a nicer camera just to take pictures.
Yeah.
We also have a lot of friends of the organization that are professional photographers. So that combination is basically where we got a lot of, these are some of my personal, I was in a chase boat on this day on the Rappahannock.
Well,
that was my favorite day of the whole summer.
That is a stunning picture.
Awesome shots. And this was just one of those days where everything lined up. We were sailing at 5 knots and a 15-mile-an-hour breeze. Somebody asked how close could you sail to the wind? Not very close. So I remember this day, the wind was kind of blowing us on the nose and we were tacking into it.
Yeah.
And after a couple of hours, we had made about a mile of headway, and they just put the sails down and rowed. Luckily, the next stop was that really, really posh campsite you might have seen. So we got bailed out that day by a really nice landowner. But, there we go. That was the end of that long day. But you could see how calm it got after that. But you really couldn't point very well. Again, it's kind of like a miniature version of Sultana. The wind has to be just right for you to really make headway. And if you want to tack, you can, but you're not, unless you have a following tide helping you, it wasn't really worth the trouble.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear on that one.
Yeah.
Chris, William gave a shout out to John Swain in the chat, so we should mention,
Awesome.
John Swain is the master shipwright who built the shallop and also built the schooner Sultana.
Yep.
Extremely cool.
Someone said they were in the town of Onancock. That was another, again, those small little towns, man. It was such a neat thing to see those towns come to life to celebrate this story. Because in most of these towns, they'd heard of the voyage. They knew John Smith might have been nearby, but they really didn't know the details. And so it was really cool to bring the story to them. And they were, it was a great economic development opportunity for them as well. So it was a real fun, symbiotic relationship with a lot of these little waterfront communities.
Yeah, the people of Onancock set a high bar for the rest of the day. I think there was someone in town who would bring us warm donuts in the morning. How does it get any better than that?
Did
Exactly.
you give them any glass beads? Hey, John, what do you think the biggest hurdle or challenge was, aside from the whole thing all at once? Did you have a day you ever wanted to quit? Did you ever a day you wanted to just kill yourself?
Yeah. There were a few. So for me, you wouldn't pick this up just in a Zoom box, but I'm a tall guy. I'm 6'3", and so my big fear was every now and then I get back issues. And so I remember a time we were in a town where we rented a hotel for the weekend, and I was just down on the hotel floor, just hoping everything would kind of reset. That was my big fear, that I would get some sort of injury that would take me out of it. And then I remember kind of a scary moment where we were coming into Tappahannock, and it was just a weather event. It was one of those pop-up summer storms, and it was one of those where the lightning flashes and the blacks and the whites get inverted briefly, and there was nothing we could do other than we just got to get to this marina, right? But that was definitely one of the scarier moments where I was like, are you sure you made good life decisions to end up in this spot?
Yep. And again, that same exact scenario happened to Smith twice. They got stranded at they got blown off course near Watts Island and had to rest on the shore, and they got stuck in a squall basically in Hooper Straits, and they got stranded on Bloodsworth Island for 3 days and blew out their mast and sail. So again, history imitating life, imitating art. It was kind of neat seeing those parallels, even though the voyages were obviously very different.
Yeah, I don't know if Smith had this one, Chris, but I remember one time we were rowing at night, and Ian was not happy with the speed at which we were rowing. And he was, like Chris mentioned, Ian's a pretty like calm, roll with the punches kind of guy, but his inflections kept getting shorter and sterner, and he was like, "What's going on with you guys?" And we're giving it all we got, and we're we had our rowing muscles by now. We couldn't figure it out either. And then we finally got to shore for our camp that night, and we realized somewhere back there, a few miles back, our rudder had hooked on to a crab pot line,
Oh,
and we've been dragging a crab pot with us the whole time.
Bummer,
So
dude.
we had a handicap.
Well, I think that gives you a pass on that.
Right. He felt bad once he realized it. He apologized.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are nearing the end of our time. If you have any further questions, let's type them in now or forever hold your peace. And I have to tell you guys, this has been a very, very impressive time. Did the Coasties cheer you on? Somebody asks.
Yeah, I think Chris is typing an answer, but yeah, they were always great to us. One of the unique things about the boat is because there was no engine on board, she did not have to be registered. So we didn't have to put any ugly stickers on the side.
And that's a help. Absolutely. Yes. Guys, I want to thank you very much for your time and a really, really impressive presentation.
Thanks so much. It was wonderful. It was great being here.
For those of you who have joined us recently, thank you for coming along with the ride. I think this has been most interesting and entertaining. Chris, if you could stop your share for a moment, and we will be in business here. I want to thank the Sultana Foundation, and especially Chris and John for taking the time tonight. And on behalf of the Great Chesapeake Bay Schooner Race, where I will see you guys next year, and the American Schooner Association, I want to thank you both very much for joining us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, great seeing you, and I'll catch you again for our next amazing presentation.